Good to be here tonight, and there we go. And Josh is going to lead us in opening prayer real quick, and then we'll get started. Josh?
Dear Heavenly Lord, praise you. Thank you so much for each and every one of us for allowing us to be your state. Thank you for this time that we have set apart. Get to study deeper. Pray that you please be with Eddie as he leads us. Please strengthen his words. Please give him strength, O Lord. Pray that you be with each and every one of us. Help us to work, to learn, to deeper meaning of your word. Pray that in everything that we do, give honor and glory to you. We pray that we always serve you with all of our heart. In your holy Son's name we pray.
Amen. All right, in case you weren't here 2 Sundays ago, Zach and I are starting a new class called Parting Words of the Wise. It is a study of great people in the Bible and the parting words that they had. And of course, not all of them, all the characters we're looking at, had long deathbed speeches, so we're going to have to look at some of the wisdom in their life as well. Such is the case tonight. And for Sunday, we're going to be looking at Joseph out of Genesis. So at the end of the book of Genesis, we have the death of Joseph and his parting words. There in Genesis 50, starting in verse 22. And it says there, "So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the 3rd generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, 'I am dying. But God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.' Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, 'God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here.' So Joseph died, being 110 years old. And they embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt." So we got 2 classes on this. Kind of like, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot there. I mean, it seems fairly inconsequential, and there's something kind of weird here about bones. But it's actually a very telling statement about Joseph. And I think it's a very important one to where we can see the faith in God of Joseph. And through my study on this, I think the best way to see the power of these words is to look at Joseph's life in detail. So we already read his death. Let's go back to his birth. So Joseph's birth is in Genesis 30. Whoa. If you don't mind, yeah. I thought I turned that off, but they've updated PowerPoint so much now that they're like, we're going to click through it for you. Well, that's not helpful. There we go. Genesis 30 and 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." So right off the bat, God decides when Joseph is born, right? I think we're seeing that here, that there's no chance about when Joseph was born. Rachel couldn't have children. You remember Leah gave Joseph a bunch of children, and then the maidens, their handmaidens, gave him children. And then finally, Rachel, who he wanted children with the whole time, finally the Lord opens her womb and gives her children. There was no chance about it. The Lord decided when Joseph was born. And then we don't really see much of Joseph for a few verses, maybe a chapter or so. And then more in the early life of Joseph. See how far it skipped ahead. Oh, good. Okay. More in the early life of Joseph. Joseph is there in Genesis 33 in verse 2. flip over to Genesis 33 and starting in verse 2. This is where Jacob and Esau are meeting after Jacob has left Laban. They haven't seen each other in quite some time now. Now they're meeting each other. And there in Genesis 33, verse 2, when Jacob meets Esau after all this time, Esau is riding towards him with 400 men. And Jacob is kind of expecting trouble. He hadn't seen him in so long. And he's scared and he's kind of afraid of what's going to happen. And so Jacob, he has his family with him and he has to line them up. And he puts, as the text says there, he puts the servants and their children out first, and then Leah and her children, and then finally Rachel and Joseph in the back. I think that's furthest from potential danger is what we're seeing there. And I think you're also starting to see that favoritism of Jacob, to Joseph. And in this scene, it actually all ends well. Joseph was not actually in any harm in any danger as it turns out. Esau doesn't hold that birthright thing against Jacob. Esau goes on to say he has plenty in 33:9. He doesn't want any repayment of any kind from Jacob, and they kiss and they hug it out. And it's actually a nice scene of forgiveness and level-headedness. And actually, I think I think it's interesting to notice that Joseph saw all that. Now, I'm not sure how old he was, but he was there, and I'm sure the story was probably recounted to him later. But Joseph saw a brother who was wronged come to a brother who wronged him, and it was a scene of forgiveness. Right? We'll come back to that thought, though. But Joseph saw a brother who was wronged forgive another. So the main part of the text that tells us most about Joseph, I think where everybody kind of thinks this Joseph story starts, well, it really does, because up to Genesis 37, it's mostly about, after we leave Isaac, mostly about Jacob. And then Genesis flips over and we start to follow Joseph more. So there in Genesis 37, it's page 36 in the Pew Bible if you're using that, Genesis 37. And we're just going to kind of work our way through the text for the rest of the evening. So you'll probably just be flipping with me. So somebody give me a break from talking for a second and summarize this section down through verse 11. So this is the part where Joseph is, it's the beginning of the story of Joseph. So somebody summarize that for me. Mm-hmm. That's right. So we've got the dreams. What else happened in this one? In this section right here. Well, they certainly see the favoritism with this coat of many colors that he gets in this section, right? Jacob gives him the coat of many colors, and you start to see where they hate him for it. And then, of course, the dreams, as Zach brought out, and the dreams, you remember that there was the dreams of his brother sheaves that bowed down to his. And then there was the second dream where the sun and the moon, and specifically 11 stars, bowed down to him. Now, who interprets all these dreams? Who? Joseph. And does anybody else interpret these dreams? Jacob. And did the brothers interpret these dreams? They all did, right? Because the meaning, the explanation is super obvious, I think, that they were all able to interpret this and see that their youngest brother, I can't remember if Benjamin's born at this time or not, that this youngest brother, or second to youngest, is saying that all of you are going to bow down to me. And then we go down to verse 12, starting in the section in verse 12 of Genesis 37. So the dreams have passed, and moving on from there, I think pretty much everybody knows this already, but in case you don't, this is the area of the world we're talking about right here. And, that looks a lot closer on my computer screen. But anyway, we have this area right here where Israel being right here and then Egypt right here. So everything we're talking about is happening pretty much right inside that area. So there, starting in verse 12, the brothers are everybody lives down here in the valley of Hebron. I could see it on my computer. I can't see it here. Hebron, right. They all live in the valley of Hebron, and Jacob sends all of his sons up to Shechem, up here, to watch over and care for the flock that they've had. Because remember, they're all shepherds. And Jacob didn't go with the brothers originally. And Jacob says that Joseph needs to be with him. He wants to know how things are going, so he sends Joseph from the valley of Hebron up to here to find them in Shechem. He can't find them in Shechem, and he finds an old man that tells him they're in Dothan over here. And up in Dothan, that's where he finds them. And then it said there in 37, from afar off, they see him coming, and they decide to kill him and throw him in a pit. And I'm paraphrasing through these chapters because they're pretty long. And Reuben, the oldest, says, no, we shouldn't kill him. We should just throw him in a pit. And Reuben's intention is to pull Joseph out of the pit and save him and take him back to Jacob. But before Reuben has the chance to do that, Judah finds some Ishmaelites who are passing by, and they're like, well, let's not kill him. Let's just take his cloak and then sell him into slavery. So as we can all remember, I'm sure, Joseph gets sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites take him to Egypt, where he is sold to, what's that? Potiphar. Right. And Potiphar is the what? What is he in Egypt? Captain. He's the captain of Pharaoh's guards. So close, yeah. He's the captain of the guards. So Potiphar is actually very much should be very much connected to Pharaoh. And then that gets us through 37. And then there in chapter 38 of Genesis, we have this quick aside where we have a seemingly out-of-place story of Judah. But if you look in Matthew 1, verse 3, we find some of the names mentioned in this story, and the characters in here are in the lineage of Jesus. So it actually is a pretty important chapter, but more so to the story of Jesus, I think, than Joseph. Do you have a comment? So moving on. So then in chapter 39, Joseph is a slave in Potiphar's house. And I'd like to read a little bit more here. So Genesis 39, starting in verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of the master of the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from that time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and he came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. He has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? The first thing to notice here is that Joseph has been put over all Potiphar's house, so much to the point that Joseph is really the one who knows what's going on, and Potiphar can sit back and do his job with Pharaoh and not really have to worry about what's going on in his house. First off, why is Joseph able to do that? Why is Joseph able to do this? Because God is with him, right? And in verse 3, it actually points that out. It says Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him. So, it was Potiphar, a man of God, as we know it. I wouldn't expect so, but he even saw that God was with him. It says that there in verse 3. And then it has here, his wife tries to seduce Joseph here, but he isn't having any of it. And why not? Why isn't Joseph having any of it? Yes, no, you're good. Who said that? He knows it's wrong, yeah. Exactly, he knows it's a sin against God. So what's his main fear here? He just listed out all these things. He just told her about his position and stuff, but what's his main fear here? Sinning against God. It doesn't seem that it's a violation. It does seem like a violation to trust Potiphar, but that doesn't seem to be the main issue. Do you think he's worried about losing the power he has in Potiphar's house? Or all the luxuries I'm sure he has in Potiphar's house? Maybe, but that's not the reason he gives her, and so it doesn't seem like. So what does this show us about Joseph? Yeah, he put God first, and he fears God. I think that's the first time we've really seen that in Joseph's story up to now. All right, and then moving on to chapter 39, and then starting in verse 20. Genesis 39 and 20. Then Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. Oh, I forgot. So, real quick, summarize. So he won't lie with her, and she lies and says that he does, or that he tries to, and take advantage of her, and that she wouldn't do it, and she has his cloak as proof, and then she just tells a bunch of lies about Joseph. And then verse 20. And then Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. And so we see it again, right? God is with Joseph. He blesses his deeds. He makes Joseph's actions fruitful. And the way we keep reading this, it kind of reminds me of the beginning and the ending of Job, right? Just how blessed Job was. And knowing God is with him. And I think we're seeing that here again with Joseph. A bit different of a situation, but so much good stuff after or following trial. Okay, so somebody summarize for me in chapter 40 the important scene we see in prison. What was happening? Right. And so, as she was just saying, and that's what happens, right? The cupbearer will be restored, and the baker loses his head, or is hanged. I don't know. It was a terrible death either way. So Joseph's interpretations there. So now we're seeing he's able to interpret these dreams, right? Earlier, the second time we've seen dreams with him, and the earlier ones, everybody was able to interpret them. And now Joseph has these interpretations. I wanted to point out here that Joseph's interpretations were given by God, as he points out in verse 8 back here. And it said there, and they said to him, we each have a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me. And he says, tell them to me, please. And so then he asks, so when the cupbearer is restored, Joseph asks him to go back and tell Pharaoh about him. And it says he hasn't done anything to be put in prison. And of course, the cupbearer goes back and tells Pharaoh everything, right? Now, the cupbearer completely forgot about him as soon as he was out. It's kind of like Jesus and those leopards, right? So the moment cupbearer was back in this position, living his good life again, he forgot all about Joseph. So Joseph's already been in prison for some time when he meets the cupbearer, and then it says there, and starting in chapter 41, we're reading down through, 2 years later, Pharaoh has these 2 dreams. And then the cupbearer remembers Joseph again. So these dreams that he has, the dreams in this chapter, you'll remember, the first one is about the skinny cows that come out of the good cows that come out of the river, the nice healthy cows. And then they're followed by 7 really ugly skinny cows. And that wakes him up and he goes back to sleep. And then he has another dream about grain that grows up and is beautiful, hardy grain. And then really lousy, dried out grain comes up after it and eats the good grain, just like the skinny cows eat the healthy cows. So it's kind of a disturbing dream, and no one in his court can tell him the meaning of the dreams. So in verse 9 of 41, the cupbearer tells him of Joseph then. So the cupbearer's been back in service for 2 years. So then in verse 14, moving down, Pharaoh sends to have Joseph pulled out of the dungeon and says, I was told you can interpret dreams. Joseph, in verse 16, again, we see these same words from Joseph, says, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Joseph again says, I'm not the one interpreting these dreams. God is. Pharaoh recounts the dreams in every detail. That's why this chapter is kind of so long, because we read it and then we read it again. And he gives every detail to Joseph. And then Joseph says there in 41:25, the dreams of Pharaoh, and then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one, and God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And then Joseph interprets the dreams, which of course the 7 healthy cows were 7 good years of crop and hardy land, and then the 7 skinny cows represented the 7 years of bad time, and the same with the wheat. Now, as we already said, Joseph know how to interpret these dreams. God gave it to him. He, in verse 16, felt the need to point that out to Pharaoh now. Now, did Joseph have any foreknowledge of this famine? Did he know about this before? I mean, is there any, we didn't, as far as we've gone through this story, he didn't know anything. And did he know he was going before Pharaoh to interpret dreams, and kind of scary ones at that? Did he know he was going to do that? We don't read anything of that in the text, right? I mean, it might have, but we don't know anything of it. So it doesn't seem from this reading as we've recounted it. Pharaoh tells him the dream, and immediately Joseph knows the answer because God gave it to him. And I think that's the way we're supposed to see it. And then in verse 32, chapter of 41. And Joseph tells them, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God and that God will shortly bring it about. So he's saying you had this dream twice because God will shortly, it's all set up by God and God's going to bring it about. Now let's think about what Joseph is saying here. How big of a prediction is this? I mean, do we read anything about the struggle? Is there any struggling in the land of Egypt right now? Have we read anything about that? I mean, Potiphar's house seemed to be doing well. So we don't hear anything we haven't read anything about Egypt struggling right now. So how big of a prediction is this? To say we're going to have 7 great years and then 7 terrible years. How big is that? Yeah, he's saying it's big enough to shift an entire nation. I mean, the ruler of the land's thinking about it right now. But think about that. How big of a prediction that is. He's predicting basically the next 14 years, right? Based off of some dreams he's just heard. And if you think about it, why should Pharaoh believe such a prediction? But those dreams were really real to him, I suppose. So what does this show us about Joseph? I mean, he went to Joseph, he interprets some dreams, and then he tells him this really kind of scary news. What does this show us about Joseph, you think? He knew exactly what to say. But yeah, I think it is a very courageous thing to do. I mean, he could have just, backed out in the first place and not wanted to interpret any kinds of dreams at all or been scared about it. What else do you think this tells us about Joseph? Go ahead, Josh. That's really good. So he was a righteous man who didn't withhold the truth from anyone from fear. What else do you think we've seen about Joseph so far? Absolutely, and that's one of the things I was hoping would come out. He was actually really humble in this because he didn't have to tell those guys in prison that, he could have acted like that was his wisdom. He figured out what was going to happen. And here with Pharaoh, he gives glory to God and says, hey, this interpretation is coming from God. I think we see Joseph is pretty wise here too. Pharaoh says it himself. It says about as much as 37 through 40. And calls him wise and doesn't think anybody else is up to the task that is going to be before them. And it shows that he trusts in God, and he trusts that these things that he is now telling Pharaoh are going to come to pass. I mean, as we said, it's 14 years of prediction here. I mean, they could have 7 great years, and then in 7 years he's going to look like a giant fool when they have an 8th great year, right? It's a big prediction. So then continuing in verse 33, Genesis 41, he offers up the solution to Pharaoh of storing up food, and Pharaoh makes him operations director of the whole effort to preserve food, and then he changes his name to, I don't even want to say it. It changes his name to Zapnath-Paneah, which is, you can find it. And Pharaoh raises up Joseph and makes him second. Makes him second over the whole land. And so how much power does Joseph have now? I mean, he went from second in the household of the king's the king's guard to second, almost, well, it didn't say he was second in a prison, but I mean, he was over a whole bunch. And now he's second over Egypt, right? So he has almost the power of Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh gives him the signet ring, but he's still under Pharaoh. So in verse 46 of chapter 41, it says there that Joseph was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh. Where we started in chapter 37, he was 17, and now he's 30. And it seemed like right after he was 17, around the time he was 17, is when he was sold into slavery. So it was 13. Joseph was 13 years as a servant, and then being in prison, basically. And then the next chunk there of chapter 41, Joseph goes all over Egypt, collecting food to store, and he also has his sons. And basically this is the first 7 years of plenty, which just gets us down to verse 54. So if you read with me, Genesis 41, starting in 54. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph has said, and the famine was in all the lands. But in all the lands of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands. So the famine that God gave Pharaoh the dreams about, that famine has now begun. The 7 great years for the land have passed. Joseph should be about 37 years old by now. That's right at middle age now. Like we're right into middle age, right, Stan? 37? Oh, we're getting there. So, okay, right, not yet prime. That's right. So, up to this point, what all has Joseph endured? What has he endured so far? What's he gone through? Rejection by his brothers, specifically, by his brothers. He was made a slave after he was treated like a favorite son, right? So he's treated like a favorite son, becomes a slave all of a sudden. I can't imagine the ride from Dothan down to Egypt was a fun ride at all. And he might have run a nice household and been fairly comfortable in the house, but in the end, he was still a slave, right? He couldn't just leave Potiphar's house whenever he wanted. He wasn't free to do that. In prison, he did work and look over things, but in the end, he was still a prisoner, right? Couldn't get out of the dungeon until, Pharaoh pulls him out of the dungeon. And now he's tasked to save the land of Egypt, but he still has to serve under Pharaoh, and it's not like he can just run off, basically. He can't just run off and do what he wants. And remember, he was sold into slavery at about 17, so it's been about 20 years without seeing his family now. So before moving on to 42, what is Joseph's attitude on all of this right now? What's his attitude? What's his mindset? He's still trusting in God. What else does his attitude look like? Absolutely, right? Yeah. As far as we've seen, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, because when we look at stories like David, Solomon, they all have these moments of failure, I think, but we haven't seen that thus far. I don't think we've with Joseph.
What would this do? Not judging anybody, but that's a pretty horrible life.
Yeah.
Of great.
Yeah.
After that, turn, idle, addict.
Yeah.
But that, I think it was, but we don't, we're not, I don't, it was, faith in God, beyond the problem.
You're right.
The problems are working through God, not, not following God. But following God.
That's what he's doing.
Follower of God.
Absolutely. Right. And God has blessed him. That's what it said. It said God blessed him in these things that he did. And so he wasn't doing great. It's God who blessed him that let him do great. Is there a hand over here?
God, that God blessing.
Absolutely. Right.
Seems like one fast burn.
Yeah. Right. And so, and I think we can see a little bit of his attitude, and then actually in the naming of his sons. So if you look with me at chapter 41, verses 51 and 52. Well, actually, I'll start in 50. And to Joseph were born, this is during the 7 good years, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came to the daughter of the priest that she bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all of my toil of my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. That sounds positive, doesn't it? I mean, he calls Egypt the land of his affliction, but still he recognizes that God has caused him to be fruitful, and God has made me forget all of my toil and all my father's house. So he's not focusing on it, right? He's not focusing on his loss. So does Joseph seem mad or distraught at this point in life? Go ahead.
He didn't ask. So this we know that he thought that.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, it kind of does seem like he's just making the best out of it, but he's not just trying to make the best out of it. He's living for God, and the best is coming out of it, I think. Kind of thinking about it. But I mean, his life, and he rose out of, I would say, most of his problems of slavery and such on when he came to serve under Pharaoh, right? Could he have met Pharaoh sooner in his life? Like, Pharaoh was the captain of, Potiphar was the captain of the guard. So he could have, by chance, met Pharaoh sooner, but first he had to go to prison and such on and so forth. Joseph, somebody could say he was a smart man. He got there from, you learn a lot of things in prison. Maybe he got there on his own. But no, God was with him the whole time. And he knew that, and I think he lived like that. And he couldn't have done it on his own, and it happened on God's time. We're going to go over the rest of this story on Sunday. If you wanted to prepare any more, I would suggest just reading through the end of Genesis from chapter 42. And I appreciate your comments tonight.